Thank you very much. I appreciate very much the invitation to the Megafauna meeting, and I'm curious what Megafauna is just as much as you. My name is Larry Crowder. I'm a professor at Stanford University, and based on the presidential election, I may be applying for asylum like in Spain or France or Canada or something. So if you want to come up and tell me if you have an extra room available or something, that would be good. As an American, I find myself having to apologize to the world frequently for the people that my fellow citizens elect. I don't understand it. I don't have a story. So don't come up and say, why did they do that? I don't know. I did not sleep very well last night, so if in the middle of my talk I just stopped talking and looked off at this corner, then you know where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk about marine megafauna as I've defined the term and used it. And mainly it comes down to things that are big. I looked at quickly at the manuscript, and people who do marine benthic ecology call anything that's big enough to see megafauna. And if you've done marine benthic ecology, you know that there are benthic organisms called the myofauna, which are little tiny microscopic things that live in the mud. And I've worked on myofaunal samples, and you should just shoot yourself now instead of working on myofaunal samples. So I kind of arbitrarily define megafauna as anything that's bigger than a meter at some point in its life history. That might be too big, but it incorporates a lot of things in marine systems. So why do we care about big animals? And this might apply to terrestrial and freshwater examples as well. But in the sea, we care about big animals because most of the big animals are undergoing rapid declines. In marine systems, so far very few extinctions in contrast to terrestrial systems, but dramatically declining abundances. We also have the idea, contrary to previous thinking, that megafauna may play really important roles in ecological systems and in how they function. So when you lose marine megafauna, you may not just lose the species, you may lose a key role that it plays in marine food webs. And then I'll also talk about some of the approaches that we've pioneered working with Rebecca Lewison, who's here. Wave your hand, Rebecca. By my count, 15 years now, which is kind of scary because Becca's only like 25. So we've been working at this for a long time, trying to figure out how to manage marine megafauna in the context of the threats. And some of the data here for Myers and worm are large fishes, tunas and swordfishes and things like that. Order of magnitude declines in the last 20 or 30 years. Most of the global fish populations are fully or overexploited in recent years. So there are very few fishes that are still populations that are under development. And you all know the history of whales. The International Whaling Commission went from an organization that organized whale exploitation to one that organized whale conservation. And only now, with some of the whales coming back, are we starting to rethink whether exploitation is possible for things like minke whales. When I first started working even on fish, I was surrounded by ecosystem ecologists who were doing biogeochemical cycling and things. They're doing carbon cycling in food webs, and they say the fish are unimportant. All of the carbon cycling is done by the bacteria and the fungi and maybe the phytoplankton, and anything above that, zooplankton, it's insignificant. And in terms of cycling carbon or energy, that's probably true, but it turns out predators play a key role in how ecosystems are structured and ultimately how they function. So even though they're relatively rare, they play a large role. And as you alter ecosystems, you can have, this is basically a tipping point kind of diagram. As the driver abundance increases, the population of a key species can undergo a rapid decline. It reaches a tipping point. But to get it back, you have to reduce the driver abundance. Maybe this is exploitation, much, much lower than the level of exploitation which actually caused the crash to allow the recovery. And so we know for a lot of these systems there's the potential for nonlinear dynamics. There's the potential for tipping points. And if most of these marine megafauna are in fact apex consumers or at least large herbivores, then removing them can have an effect that's called a trophic cascade, where, for example, you take the example I'll talk about is the sea otters off the top. The urchins increase in abundance. They suppress the abundance of kelp, and the urchins take over the role in that system. That kind of trophic cascade happens in marine systems, it happens in freshwater systems, it happens in terrestrial systems. And so what it suggests is that when you screw around with the abundance of large predators or herbivores, you can have unexpected effects. It's not just the single species, but effects on the whole population. My friend Jim Estes, and I also worked with John Thorborg when I was at Duke, put this together in a book about trophic cascades that almost inevitably involves stories about megafauna and how the effects of removing megafauna impact systems. And probably the terrestrial folks here will tell the story better than I do. But I think at one point we didn't think about losing wolves in Yellowstone National Park influencing the birch trees. But there's a cascade of interactions which get to the birch trees and whether you have recruitment of birch trees. And certainly in terrestrial systems and in marine systems, there's lots of evidence for the potential for removing top predators having large trophic cascade effects. A large group of people wrote a science paper just about 5 years ago now that they called Trophic Downgrading of Planet Earth, basically saying we've so altered the systems, terrestrial, marine, freshwater, that we're basically lopped off at least one trophic level. And to do that and expect there to be no change in the function of the rest of the ecosystem or the structure of the rest of the ecosystem is probably really naive. And this photo in the bottom corner is a working group that Jim Estes got together. He's the guy in the leather jacket. Some of you will probably know Jim, about third from the left there, to talk about these issues. And we're still trying to figure out how to quantify the impact of loss of megafauna on the structure and function of marine ecosystems, but we know that it's going to be important. This is probably the classic case that started from Jim's work, and it was basically something he discovered by observation, that in some areas the sea otters had been removed by hunting for otters, and in other cases they were still present. And when the otters are present, they subdue the urchins. There's kelp and all the kelp associates and so on. And as he's built out the story, there are other players that come in that turn out to be important. One of the controversial recent papers was the argument that because humans hunted great whales, the killer whales that actually used to kill great whales now have switched to the fuzzy guys, right? All the way down to sea otters. And first they ate stellar sea lions and harbor seals and things like that, depleted those steadily, and then they got down to sea otters. And if you look at the dentition of a killer whale, it's like Tyrannosaurus rex, right? Otters, sea otters are like popcorn. Toss the sea otter in, you don't even need those teeth, right? Those teeth are evolved to tear flesh. And in fact, the fellow who first gave the name to what became killer whales called them whale killers in the original documents. And so Jim published this paper that said, so human hunting of great whales led to not enough food for the killer whales, so the killer whales began eating the furry guys and generated the trophic cascade. The other trophic cascade term that's not in here, and we wrote a paper on this last year, is what drove otter harvests. And there's a fascinating story about what drove otter harvests was fashion in China. It became very stylish to have really deep, dark, rich northern otter fur from Alaska on the gowns for these wealthy Chinese people back in the beginning in the 1800s. And when the exploitation of otters first started happening, first by the British and then by the Americans, they were selling otter pelts for $15 or $20 US in current currency. When they became more rare and more valuable, and all of the exports were going to China for these really very wealthy people, a single pelt went to $5,000, $10,000. The last pelt that was sold in London before the fur trade closed was $28,000 for one pelt. So just like feathers for women's hats that drove a lot of birds to extinction. Fashion contributed to the decline of sea otters and nearly drove them to extinction. So Jim cataloged a whole set of examples. I don't have time to go through these. Not just the sea otters, but the great whales, the cod in the North Atlantic, tropical reef fish, especially herbivores that influence that eat the macroalgae, sharks, salmon, tuna. All of these have stories that have to do with removing some species of marine megafauna and have documented cascading effects. And so when we reduce the abundance of marine megafauna, it's not just, oh, gee, that's too bad we don't have green turtles. We don't have green turtles and all of the ecosystem services and impacts that they imply. So one of the questions that he's been grappling with and we've been grappling with is, are these kinds of cascades extreme cases or are they more common than we thought? If we look at other systems, and since we have a wide representation here of terrestrial and freshwater people, this will be a good question to ask for the Megafauna Symposium. Is this a reason why megafauna are important besides people care about them? They influence the abundance and structure of other components of the system. With Becca and a whole team of other people, we've been working on how can we reduce the impact of people on marine megafauna, and we're developing an approach that we're calling dynamic ocean management. And what it does is take the rapid advancements in biologging, satellite tagging in particular, that you put on these animals and they're swimming around in the ocean. There's a lot of remotely sensed oceanographic data so that you can actually develop habitat models that help us understand why the animals are where they are and what their movement patterns are relative to fixed and dynamic ocean features. So unlike terrestrial systems where the streams pretty much stay in the same place, these oceanographic features, fronts and eddies, move around. When David Heirenbach suggested this idea in 2000, 15 years ago, I read the story and I said, this is bullshit, we can't do it, but we can now do it. So we can develop these models for where animals are and where they're likely to move with some reasonable reliability. And then we can also look at human activities, whether it's shipping or fishing or whatever the threat is, and look for opportunities to conduct those human activities in a way that reduce the overlap with megafauna that might be taken as bycatch, for example, in those fisheries. So rather than closing fisheries or requiring fisheries to change fishing gears, the question is, can you allow the fishermen to work where the sea turtles are not? But you have to keep in mind that the sea turtles are in different places at different times. So the way you might get to this is marine protected areas that move. Okay, so fishermen might have restrictions, but only in the areas where the animals are thought to be. We've had a lot of experience with marine protected areas and in fisheries with time area closures, but there's right now a disconnect between the technology that people use to catch fish, which is real time. The longliners are out there with really high-tech gear. They know what the oceanographic conditions are. They're setting for temperatures in 70 meters of water to catch where the swordfish are. But most of fisheries management has until now been static. Rules are put into place. There's public meetings and so on to decide if they're appropriate and so on. And in order to use dynamic ocean management, that whole process of making management decisions would have to speed up. Ultimately, the goal would be to increase the flexibility of management measures to allow fisheries to continue but reduce bycatch, or allow shipping to continue but reduce collisions with whales, for example. A recent study done by Daniel Dunn, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, did what I call a cartoon model. It was just to illustrate, if you have a big closure to protect a hypothetical species like sea turtles through an entire year, and the contrast is small closures that move through the year, how big do those small closures have to be to provide the same level of protection as the big box? And the answer is 15 or 20% the size of the big box. And so the notion is that the fishermen would honor that small box, and the small box could move through the season, then 80% of the fishery stays open. That's a deal you might be able to make with the fishermen. And we're currently working with the swordfish fishery in California to discover those issues. And so the approach requires integrating a lot of different big data sets from a variety of sources on biological, oceanographic, social, economic, genetic data, and so on. But it can be coupled into existing frameworks for making management decisions. The management in this case would have to be more autonomous because the animals are moving and the people are moving. But you're familiar with this kind of autonomous management because you all fly in airplanes, right? And when you're flying in an airplane, and I'm familiar with San Francisco Bay Area airports, there are 3 major airports there. Whether you move in or out depends on what the weather is. And when the wind changes in direction or it gets foggy, they don't sit down and say, gee, what should we do? They have a plan for dynamically managing movements inside and outside the airport that kicks in when the clarity drops to some level, okay? And the potential is for marine management, we could also do that kind of thing. So we've been working with NASA and NOAA funding in the US to try to get to approaches that we think could actually work. We've engaged the fishermen and the managers in these discussions. And right now we're pretty far along on the science case. I'd be happy to, or Becca would be happy to talk to you about this some more. But we're still working on the law and policy case. And so the idea is to develop an application that supports really rapid response and adaptive management that can respond to changing conditions, both in the environment and in management. We published a string of papers starting about 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm going to talk about the top one because it's a particularly interesting one. Elliot Hazen and the team published a paper in Nature Climate Change where he took data from the TOP program, which put satellite tags on 4,300 animals from 23 different species in the North Pacific ecosystem. And he developed these habitat models for 15 of those species and got good statistical fits. They looked like to be really reliable models. And then he said, what happens if we run these habitat models that tell us where animals are and how they move relative to fixed and dynamic oceanographic features, and we then run that ahead with climate models for the ocean and say, where will they be 50 years from now? Where will they be 100 years from now if they're responding to the same oceanographic conditions that we see them responding to now? And it turned out to be really quite interesting. For the shark gill, for example, in the upper corner there, over time from now to 2100, the amount of core habitat area that they are likely to occupy is going to decline. For tunas, the core habitat area will actually increase with climate change. There'll be more square kilometers of tuna habitat in the future. And what that suggests, there are winners and losers. And so the graph on the right side there shows the percentage change. A lot of key species that we're quite worried about, the sharks, are not only going to be finned and overfished and things like that, but also compressed into smaller and smaller habitat space. And the albatrosses and the shearwaters and some of the others are actually going to benefit, we think, from the changes that occur over this period. So I hope I've convinced you that we have issues with marine megafauna. A lot of the big critters are declining. It's important because they have food web effects, and it's not just because Larry Crowder loves leatherback sea turtles that they're important, but they're important to the function of the rest of the system. And there are ways to deal with it from understanding, a deep understanding of the behavior and movements of the animals relative to the behavior and human movements of humans that generate threats to them. So I'll stop there, and I think we have time for questions or whatever you want to explore.